Welcome everyone from Dublin, near Dublin, virtually in Dublin. We'll be starting this at the top of the hour in about 3 minutes. Well, good evening, everyone, and good morning to anyone who's here in San Francisco with me. My name is Rich Mironov, and I wanted to thank the hosts of ProductTank Dublin, Ben and John and Stephen and all the other folks behind there. In order to simplify today's technology, we're going to skip having them do an intro for me, and I'm going to leap in directly and start this from here. So give everybody another minute or two to come on. And if somebody else wants to confirm that they are hearing me and that we're coming across clear, the best place would be in the live comments. So if there's somebody else who can confirm we're all being heard. Okay, Simon's on, Sharon's on, John's on. I think we'll give everybody maybe one more minute because I suspect that there's a lot of folks who want to join us. Okay, perfect. Good that audio is coming across. Always exciting when we have new tools. Okay, so I'm going to do a quick introduction for myself, again, with thanks to the ProductTank Dublin team. I was hoping to be in Dublin personally myself in the physical being, but not to happen. It was my regular annual trip to what used to be called DIT and is now called TUD to do some teaching, and therefore a chance for me to get back with the Dublin ProductTank team. But here we are virtually, so let's move ahead. And a quick introduction for me, for folks who don't know me, I've been in the software product management game for a very long time, since the 80s. I suspect some of you online here weren't born when I had my first product management job. That's only important to say that this is not a new thing, but often what I see is that product management arrives whenever it's needed, and so sometimes it feels like a new thing. I do coach and mentor a lot of product leaders. I do some design of product management organizations, And I sometimes do the job we call the smoke jumper VP of product or chief product officer, where I drop into a company for a quarter or two to straighten things out. Probably most important for this talk is that I've been involved with some of the folks in the Agile movement and Agile development since roughly 2005. Again, not a new thing, but I'm old school here. What you'll hear over the next 40 minutes or so is really bringing us back to core Agile philosophy, which is to do frequent incremental experimental things to see if we can improve our processes or our teams or the way we're getting our work done, rather than adhering to any particular book or big quotes best practices where somebody else has some idea of how it worked somewhere else. I generally find that's not particularly exciting. Folks who pick up the Scrum book with no help and do just what the Scrum book says pretty much end up in some well understood corners and have trouble getting out. So we'll talk about Agile small a versus Scrum or Kanban or any of the specific approaches as we go along. And then last thing, of course, as a product person, I'm much more interested in outcomes. Are we shipping things that matter? Are customers happy and paying us money? Are we getting to the outcomes that we want? Much, much more than any particular process. So if a process isn't working, we're going to throw it out. We're going to replace it. We're going to experiment. We're going to try something new. Okay, so that frames up the talk. Let me dig into a particular instance that caused me to put a blog post and some thought together on this, which was I was working with one of my development teams, again, because I'm often an interim head of product, or I lean in with teams that may need some help. And my development team had some very strange feedback for me, which I didn't understand at first. And they were telling me two things that may apparently seem in conflict. The first thing they told me was all of my user stories were insufficient. They needed more detail. I wasn't clear enough. The metrics weren't good. What about acceptance criteria? And they went on and on about how I was shirking my duty and not delivering decent user stories because I was missing all this stuff, right? And most important in this is the word all, because like many of the folks out in the world, when my development team sees something they don't like, instead of trying to parse it and get all the detail, they assume it's a universal. So for a little while, all of my user stories need more detail. Now, perhaps 2 or 3 days later, we had a very funny reverse conversation where my same team told me that somehow all of my stories were too prescriptive, too focused on how. I wasn't giving them the room, the slack, the freedom to figure out how to solve problems. I wasn't giving them the what. Notice that these are in pretty direct opposition. So I was scratching my head for a little bit. And so for this next 30 or 40 minutes, we're going to unpack this and ask the question of what's really happening here. How is it possible that on even numbered days, all of my user stories are too thin and watery and lack substance? And on the odd numbered days, they're too prescriptive and too heavy and nobody wants to get through them. So great. We're going to continue to unpack that. And before we come back to my development team, I want to make this sort of general observation about what happens when we take people's word for what they want us to do. As product folks, we spend all day, all week, all weekend, all year hearing from folks who want us to do things. But we have to be suspicious. We have to dig in. We have to be questioning. And so here's my quote. We'll get a better one in a second. But I generally assume, and I try to coach my product managers to remember that users often tell us what they want, but they often, even more importantly, don't understand what they need. They don't know what's good for them. They don't know our product architectures or which choices we've made or the economics of our products or legal restrictions or all kinds of other things. So when users tell us what to do, we want to be pretty suspicious. We want to inquire. We want to dig in. We want to unpack that, right? There's one of the very famous games from the 90s, one of the early online games, had a big red button in it that said, "Don't push this button." Of course, if you push the button, it reset the game and you start all the way at the beginning, because they knew that folks wouldn't read the instructions or maybe would ignore the instructions. Okay, so this is me. I'm just me. Let's find somebody a little more famous and important to say the same thing, which is Alex Osterwalder, So he co-built many of the canvases you're using, the business model canvas, lots of really good material he puts out, and he tries to train big corporations on how to be innovative, a challenging thing. And his formulation of this, of course, is that customers are experts in what they want or what they want to achieve, not how to achieve it. And so we need to unpack what they demand from us and finally arrive at what's really the issue and therefore how to problem solve it, right? So we're going to turn this back around now and apply it back to my development team, because we know that a lot of folks, when they ask or demand for something, they're not clear on the difference between symptoms and root causes. They've poorly framed their problems or their solutions. They've thought it through incorrectly. There's other stakeholders, right? You can see the list here. And so I observe over and over and over again that if we as product folks do what we're told to do, we rarely deliver anything that matters, that has an outcome, that solves the problem, that helps the world. Right? So we should have very strong biases against writing down on a Post-it note what somebody told us to do, whether that's an executive or a customer or a prospect or our own development team. And instead, right, we want to do what product managers do. Unpack, look for context, look for issues, reframe the problem, share it with the team, walk it through, look for alternatives, right? There's hard work to do here. And so as we unpack what my team really wants from me, or maybe for me, I want to be much more analytical than they were. And this will bring us all the way back. I don't know if anybody's old enough to remember this screenshot. This is from the 2001 Agile Manifesto page. You can get there, it's agilemanifesto.org. And I've circled the very, very first principle that the Agile Manifesto folks highlighted for themselves and for us, which is we value individuals and interactions over processes and tools. That's really important, because if the tools don't get us where we want to go, or the processes don't help us, it doesn't matter that some Scrum book or Kanban book or piece of advice said we should do it a particular way, right? We value and we trust our team members and our interactions and our intuitions and our sense of working together over any particular recommendation for tools, best practices, processes, ways to write user stories. Don't care, right? And so when I parachute into a company, which I often do, by the way, most of you, I think, should be pleased that I haven't parachuted into your company, because on average, the companies that ask me to come in as their interim head of product have a world of hurt and a stack of issues, and things are not going well. So ideally, you won't see me in that role. You'll see me much more presenting or coaching. But when I look for strong markers of agile organizations that know what they're doing, it's not how they write user stories. It's not whether they have signed copies of Scrum books handy, but it's things that look like this. Does the development team have itself organized in whole stable teams? So that's, front end and back end and machine learning if there is, and test automation and DevOps and tech writers and designers, whatever those are, as stable whole teams that are going to be together for the very long term. They're going to be assigned to work on some piece of the customer value stream, not a random assortment of technology. And they're not the folks who take whatever next ticket comes in. They're the folks who work diligently and lovingly on some portion of our product for the long term. So when there's a problem, when there's a bug, when there's an issue, they own their work, right? What are the markers for me? The second one, really important, again, putting my product manager hat on, both the product manager and the development team, big and here, are learning directly from real end users, not proxies, not stakeholders, not our own executives, not our sales team, not just tickets that come from our support or customer success organization, but product managers on my team in my organization are going to set up real face-to-face or direct video conversations with real users who run our stuff. They're going to do that at least once a week, and they're going to invite some or all of their development team in to hear directly from the users and customers about their experience. It's critically important in my view, because what we hear from customers has much more emotional resonance. And when product managers do all the translating, often we miss some of the cool stuff. So having a designer in the room, having a developer in the room, they're going to hear things that we don't hear. So, 100 good reasons why you shouldn't be depending third hand on notes out of Salesforce from your sales team or somebody else's win-loss analysis. And you should be getting your team into that meeting. Okay, let's keep going. Third thing for me, and we'll come back to this a few times, the whole team works on the problems and the whole team works on the solutions. So as the product manager, I bring back what I believe to be a good description of the problem. Often my team corrects me and sends me back to learn again, but I don't just bring back a solution. I want the whole team on the whiteboard or on the virtual Miro or mural, whatever you're using. We're going to figure it out together because I know that many of the folks on my development team are smarter than I am. In fact, they'll tell you they're all smarter than I am. And so I need to harness their brains, not just their fingers. How do we get everybody thinking about alternate solutions by understanding the problem? Okay, keep going. Automated test suite. It's off topic for us today, but any team that's doing manual testing is wasting almost all their time and money, and they're not delivering strong, good quality software. And I think any team that has people assigned to write tests and calls them testers or QA isn't using those brains very well. I'm a strong believer in having everyone on my team write tests. People write their own unit tests. Everybody on the team is involved in test automation. Everybody on the team has to get clean code checked in that passes everybody else's test. So try to avoid second-class citizens and try to avoid manual testing, especially if we ship it off to some distant place, because automated testing is going to save us 5x or 10x money and infinite time. All right, keep going. Objectives, and we won't really tackle these here, but the objectives or the goals for a product or an epic should really be about end user behavioral change. What's going to be different? How are my users going to improve? What set of calls are going to go down in terms of tickets? What transactions are going to be faster or easier or more correct? Honestly, nobody cares about delivery dates if you're delivering value, except maybe the execs outside of development who don't really understand what we're doing. And then last thing, I think probably, one of the most important one here, and it'll be the theme for the rest of these slides, is the team gets together for serious retrospectives, ideally every week or at the end of every sprint if you're doing sprints, and we ask ourselves hard questions. What worked? What didn't work? What can we do more of? What should we stop doing? And we usually pick one or two little experiments for the next week. A change in tools, a change in check-ins, a change in meeting schedules. Maybe the stand-ups happen a different way. Every week we should have some little experiment that we're going to run next week. And it's an experiment because if it doesn't work out, we're going to throw it away and undo it. And it's going to be very low cost. And if it works out well, we're going to adapt and adopt it for our ongoing process. And we'll think of the next experiment. Notice again that this takes us away from textbooks. Doesn't matter what the Kanban manual says, doesn't matter what the Scrum book says. My team's going to wander off into places where we're learning how to do our work better as a team for our product and our customers. If you're not doing this, then you're in a sort of frozen, stable, not best of breed agile model where you're just doing it out of the book. So again, this is one of my markers for teams that are actually doing real agile work because it lets them evolve. And then of course, the last thing we need is trust, right? If you and your team don't trust each other, if you can't tell each other the truth, if criticizing some of the processes you're following are painful, people get upset, it's going to be really hard to do agile. It's harder remotely, but as we all know, and we're adapting in the world, remote is how most things are going to get done, at least for the next few quarters. So how do we build trust? Right? And then my last quote from somebody I've been following, I've actually never met John Cutler, although we're often in the same city. I just think he's wicked smart. He's now an evangelist for one of the monitoring companies at Amplitude. But he told me this, and it was he wrote this, it was really smart, right? He notices that really good teams talk about stuff, and they talk about stuff that didn't work, right? What were the surprises? What were we disappointed about? right? And then they learn and they figure out what to do next. And that's, kind of the opposite of the big quote best practices where folks tell you how to do it and they tell you there's a right way. All right, so enough of the agile background for anybody who may not have seen those or wasn't old enough to when it first happened. Let's dig back into user stories a little bit. And honestly, I don't care if anybody uses user stories, but they're frequently adopted. So let's take that as our next jumping off point. And here I've got some quotes from Ron Jeffries, who did some of the very, very earliest work around what we now know as user stories. And he talked about the 3 C's. And you can see one of these is a card, right? And this was intended to be lightweight, right? So if we have to write it on a card, that's fine. If we put it on a Post-it note, that's fine. If we put it into a Jira system or something else, that's fine. We're going to write down a pretty simple thing that says what we're trying to accomplish with this story. The second C is conversation, really important. So rather than product managers put tickets into Jira or whatever system you're using and never speak with their development teams, and the developers or the designers open up those tickets and read them, cards or stories are really just an excuse to get everybody together and talk through what we need to do if it isn't obvious. So conversation trumps card, if I can use that verb in our current environment. And then the last thing is, you really want some confirmation that usually goes on the back of the card that says, how do we know it worked? Do we have objectives? Do we have metrics? Do we have goals? Success criteria? Do we expect 4% or more of our users to adopt this feature? Do we think this is going to drive down the number of tech support calls around our bad login process? Is this going to drive new customers or new upsell? Write it down, and write it down before we get there, because otherwise we're all going to invent some after the fact excuse for why we were all very successful, right? The reason we want to write down our confirmations before we start the work is maybe they're not good, or people don't understand them, or it's not going to work, right? So there's our card. And notice if we wanted to use something completely different, we could, whether you call it a story or a card or anything else. All right, so finally, let's circle back to my team. And we did some retrospective here. Here's a classic retrospective board, right? What do we do more of? What do we do less of? What do we keep? Are there things that are confusing us or puzzling us or frustrating us? What did we like? By the way, do expect your team when you say, well, what did you really like? What was enjoyable this week? Usually the first response is the pizza and beer that you brought us. So don't minimize that. You may have to bring them pizza and beer. Okay, but I took my team through this exercise and we asked these questions. Instead of, are all of my stories too long or all of my stories too short, we turned that around and said, we printed out the last 20 or 25 stories, I forget how many there were, and we asked a much more nuanced question. Okay, team, which of the stories are too long and why are they too long? Do we notice anything about them? So here I'm finally harnessing my developers' big brains and big egos to try to figure out a problem that I've helped them frame. Instead of them complaining to me, we're going to ask interesting questions. And of course, the reverse question here that follows is, well, which stories are too short? Why are they too short? How do we know they're too short? Right? So we're digging in and we're digging into the details. And here's what we discovered. Again, you'll be shocked. Maybe you won't be shocked. But we discovered that different kinds of stories want different kinds of treatment. In fact, there were some groups of stories that I was enraging my team because I'd written all this long technical stuff and half of it was wrong, and they thought I was sort of dumb and the wrong person to write the long stories. On the other hand, we had some other stories that were clearly too short, and I was leaving out all the good stuff they wanted. And when we started to pile these into groups, when we started to notice the patterns, suddenly we're actually able to make some improvements. So here's what we learned. I'll give you my little build chart here, right? So we ended up with about 6 story groups, and this is going to be completely different from what your team does. And notice it doesn't have to be about stories. This is just an example. Here's what we noticed. Some of the stories were very UX heavy. There were workflows. There were lots of clicks and buttons in them. And I was sort of shirking on this. I was under delivering on this. And so what the team taught me was that for them, for us, for our product, when there's UX and workflow heavy changes, there's a lot more detail they want. There's the red, you see, more detail. What's our goals? Let's do storyboards. Our designer's going to lead the conversation. Do we have journey maps, jobs to be done? What happens when they click in the wrong place? You can see that for UX heavy workflow changes, the team's going to have a lot of interesting questions. Now, maybe the answers don't actually have to go into a story. If I partnered well with my UX UI designers, they probably have a whole bunch of assets that are much smarter than my story. In fact, my story might just say, hey, change the workflow in the way that the designers have put up all these storyboards, right? But notice again, for this class of stories, my team was really hungry for more. Okay, let's keep going. Performance, scalability, infrastructure. Oh, they scolded me on this. I'll actually tell a side story about this. I did some work years ago at a company here that does virtual operating systems called Wind River Systems. And one of the things we had to do, because some of those systems go into cars, automotive systems that boot up when you start the car, and they are in control of the automatic braking systems. And Mercedes and BMW and some of the other European car manufacturers had a big complaint because it took too long for the Wind River Systems OS on a chip to boot up, and the braking system wasn't coming on fast enough. So it was clear that what we needed to do was boot up this operating system on a chip, probably 6 times faster. And so I wrote a story that said, boot up the operating system on the chip 6 times faster. And then I proceeded to write about 1,000 words of how to do that. Boy, was that a mistake. Because here's what we learn when we try to teach our development team, particularly our senior developers and architects, about performance and scalability. It turns out they understand this a lot better than I do, right? And they're the ones who understand the internal metrics, and they're going to come up with lots of different hypotheses for how to speed up the code or overlap or multitask or break it into microservices, right? And so in this case, what they wanted from me was way less detail. Tell us what the performance goal is. Tell us what the scalability goal is, right? We are smarter than you about how this stuff has been built, so get out of our way, less detail. And it actually made my life easier because I delegated almost all the story writing back to the senior technical members of the team. All I had was acceptance criteria, right? Boot 6 times faster. When it's done, we're done, right? So again, notice we're dividing this up because now we're going to get to divide and conquer. Third choice, there were a bunch of lightweight bug fixes in there, right? And honestly, if when you click the button that's supposed to save the document and it does something other than save, it's a bug, nobody needed me to write this long-winded thing that said, as a user of our software, I want the save button to actually save my document, right? That was all wasted time. What we really wanted out of the reports of the bugs was we wanted a reproducible set of bugs. What are the steps, right? Step 1, log in. Step 2, create a fake document. Step 3, hit the save button. Step 4, notice it didn't save anything, right? In order to fix bugs, what we really want is the detailed step-by-step, and often that comes right off of support tickets or information from customer success. So less for me to do, less framing. Fix bug 22, here's the steps. Right, let's keep going. All right, other ones. Validation and experiments. So I'm hoping that almost everybody listening is doing some really early validation of new potential features or options or capabilities. And we might even just do that with a pencil sketch or a balsamic or tilting up a web page that has nothing behind it, but just a few buttons so folks can fake around with it. And it turns out that my team, and I think probably most of your teams, are extremely excited and interested in validation, experiment, and research. They're secretly worried that we're going to ask for the wrong things that are going to be waste, right? And they're excited by the chance to exercise their brains and think about quick and dirty ways we can find out that our work's going to be useful. Nothing frustrates my teams more than building a feature on time with high quality that does just what it's supposed to do, and having nobody use it, having it sit idle, right? So for validation experiments, we really wanted to do much more context, more collaboration. We wanted to argue about testing goals. We wanted to get everyone in the room to think of the way we could do some experiment with less code or no code, right? We wanted to be clear about our assumptions and how we would know if this thing passed. This was fun. This was energizing, right? And it helps me get my team bought in to the deep empathy that we all need to have for our end users. Because if we're thinking about what matters to them, then we're building the right stuff. Okay, let's keep going. Research, refactoring tech debt, right? Here again, I'm the least capable person on my team to tell anybody how to fix anything. In fact, I may be the least capable person on the team to prioritize this list. So here's what this one team and I decided. We said, okay, the team's going to choose what tech debt we retire up to a budget. We were doing story points for this team. We said, okay, we're going to spend, I don't know, 65 story points a month retiring tech debt. And the developers and the designers get to choose what to spend those 65 points on. Now, it's incumbent on them to choose wisely, because if we retire some tech debt, we do some refactoring, and it doesn't help us build product faster, and it doesn't relieve their pain, and it doesn't get us, more joy, then we've wasted those 65 points. But I'm perfectly willing, if we have a budget for tech debt, to give over the controls and let my team steer, because they'll make good decisions, right? And then the last one here, a little bit of an oddball left field, as we American baseball fans would say. There were a couple of stories that had to do with very specific branding and artwork that came from the marketing organization. And turned out nobody on the team, including me, really had permission to change our brand or rearrange our style sheet. So for those few stories, what we really needed, and it might have come from marketing, in fact, was exact specs. Give us the pixel perfect rendering. Where does it go? How many spaces to the left, right? Because we're not the people who are the deciders on the artwork and the branding. So just wrapping up this long build, because it's really the key to the message for this this talk, is notice that when we say all of anything, we get this wrong. They're all too long, they're all too short. No, some of them need more detail. Some of them need less detail. Some of them need more context. A few of them need exact specs that come from somewhere outside our team. When we're smart about asking good questions, we and our team can get to better answers and improve our process, improve our approach, save time, waste frustration. I could have tried to do this myself and failed miserably. This also built up a lot of trust between me and my team, because suddenly it's clear to everyone that I'm less interested in being the one with the right answer or being in charge, being the boss of them, and much more interested in having the team do better work that we're happier with, that's faster and has less friction. Okay, so if we draw a few of these stories, because I did want them to be user stories on Post-it notes. So here's one. Here's a bug, right? Here's a data retrieval bug. And notice it's just the steps, right? Enter an invalid date, leave the account number blank, hit click, something bad happens, okay? Almost anybody on the team can now follow through that logic and figure out where we forgot the case, where we didn't trap for missing fields, whatever we did, right? So classic front end UI breakage, pretty straightforward. We might slot this to maybe one of the junior folks on the team who needs to really know how the piece parts underneath work. Okay, the example for my faster boot up here, I took 4x, right? Doesn't matter about the number. And here we're gonna have a series of architect-led ideas. And so the team's gonna pick and prototype microcoding and changes in responses and higher SLAs for AWS instance and reducing data counts and whatever else they think of, right? And we're going to do that until either we hit diminishing returns or we hit our goal. And I, as the product person, I'm going to happily cross my arms and sit in the back of the room. And at the end of each sprint, ask how much faster we're booting up. And when we get to 4x, yes, I'll bring in the pizza and the beer and maybe the t-shirts, because that's my job. And then an example here of what we would call a concierge test. So for anybody who hasn't done concierge tests, that's where we fake a service. So the concierge is a human who's going to do this work for a customer or a user and see if we even understand what the work is and whether anybody wants it. In this case, I was doing some stuff with a company that does automated investment portfolios for stock retirements, on the continent you guys would call share trading. And we didn't want to build this feature unless it was going to be useful. So we added a button onto a version of the interface that only a small number of folks could see. And the button said, rebalance your stock portfolio. And when a user clicks the button, what happens is it puts up a message. It says, we'll rebalance your portfolio tonight. And it routes an email to somebody who's a human in the ops team who's going to manually rebalance their portfolio. Notice that, first of all, we've done very, very light development work here. Second, we're going to be able to test whether our user base really cares about this. And we had a goal. If less than 0.5% of our users didn't click this button, we were going to take it away. And if more than 0.5% were going to click this button, we were going to go ahead and roll forward and start the development. A big bonus here for us was having somebody doing this manually for a few weeks meant that we could actually look over their shoulder and figure out how they were doing it. Now, maybe they were doing it right, maybe they were doing it wrong, but it was a great proof of concept that we could automate something if we could have a human do it first. Again, notice that I've written all these on Post-it notes, but maybe none of them are in the format that you might write a user story. And honestly, I don't care how you write a user story. You're welcome to put the words as a user, if those are helpful, but it might have been, as an investor who wants to rebalance their portfolio, it might have been as a car company that wants to have their braking system start faster. But the value isn't in the structure of the sentence. The value is in the smartness of the thinking, right? Bullet points, full sentences, Comic Sans, Jira, Post-it notes, scrawled on the whiteboard, don't care, right? The goal is to have your team understand what we need to do and to participate. Okay, so having beaten that one to the ground, let's do a couple of takeaways, and then we're going to try the experiment of opening this up for Q&A. All right, so here's my takeaways. For those not familiar with it, that's a takeaway container here in the States. Okay, good. So I don't believe in any universal, perfect, platonic agile processes. They're just tools. Don't get hung up on what the book says. Get some coaching from somebody who's done it before who might have 16 other ideas, right? User stories are just tools. Sprints are just tools. I think retrospectives are pretty important, but there's 100 ways to run them, right? If it's not working for you, try something new. You got to dig deep. And I've made the point over and over again, but folks will give you an explanation for what they want you to do. They're almost always wrong. They're almost always incorrect or off topic or impossible or harder than you and your team can figure it out, right? So understand their pain, understand their problem, channel their issue, but don't get confused by how they tell you to fix it, right? And then do what I tell you. Again, I think that wastes half your team's talent and all of their enthusiasm. Your developers and designers come to work not just because you pay them, but because they care about the work, they care about the users. If we can pipe into our team real emotional content from our users, our developers and designers are going to work twice as hard and they're going to work twice as smart. So don't waste the enthusiasm of your team by insisting on being the buffer between them and all the good stuff out there. And then, of course, we focus on outcomes and real value. Nobody cares when the feature ships. They really don't. And nobody even cares that the feature could make us money unless users use it to make us money, right? Velocity is a metric for companies that don't understand how to measure value. Because velocity means we're doing more stuff, but we're probably doing a lot of the wrong stuff because we're measuring just throughput, right? And then, clear thing for agile teams, and we say this over and over again, but executives can't hear it. We want to start fewer things. WIP, work in process or work in progress, right? Start fewer things and finish what you start. Minimize the interrupts to your team. You as a product manager and I as a product manager need to throw our bodies in the way of every crazy person in our company who wants to wander past us and get something really small stuffed into this week's development queue, right? Everybody on the team, everybody on the company wants to interrupt some member of my development team when they're thinking deeply to ask a silly question, right? So we as product folks have to help make sure that we're starting fewer things, we're finishing them, and we're getting them out to market, right? And then, of course, the last thing here, said it over and over again, your team engagement matters, retrospectives matter, experiments matter, not just about experiments for your product, but experiments for how you get work done and what your processes are. Okay, I'm going to take a deep breath, show you a picture of me and one of my two office managers, and then we're going to open this up for questions. So for anybody who didn't know, this is Celeste. She's my senior office manager. I get a lot of complaints when she doesn't show up on some of our calls. Here's how to find me. And most importantly, if you look at the URL on the second row there, I have 19 years of posts and talks and tools and podcasts and other things free. So I hope if you found this useful, you'll wander around my site, maybe sign up for my free mailing list, or take whatever is useful there in terms of materials around product and product strategy. Okay, so I'm going to back up to our takeaways here, and then I'm going to come back to our window. And I see a lot of questions, so I'm going to start near the top. So let's see. Yes, we're going to post a link in the meetup group. I believe this is being recorded so everybody can get it. Let's see. Pragya's question, are there story points as a measure of effort dying out? There was always some team confused about how to define it, ends up not being used at all. I see a lot of teams use story points, but I don't get philosophical about it. If they want to use strawberries, if they want to use person days, whatever, there's a lot of very fine legalistic arguments about story points versus other things. I generally let my team decide. I like to start with story points because they're unitless and they sort of avoid the executive problem of measuring us by story points against other teams. So we want to strongly push back when our executives give us a KPI or a metric or a goal for the quarter to ship more story points, because that's not what we're about. But you want to use something else, that's fine. I generally don't like engineer weeks or developer weeks because that suggests that all the developers are the same and it encourages people to be forced to work weekends. But take what you like. I see all kinds of things here. I do find there's a lot of good alternatives though to planning poker. And hats off to Mike Cohn, who's really engineered and invented so much of this stuff. But there's a great card sorting mechanism that Ron Lichty taught me, which is a card snake. And you put a bunch of cards down and you put the next card in between the two that seems to indicate its size. And in 25 minutes, we can do a quick estimation of probably 50 or 60 tickets. But okay, good. All right, Colin wants to know, one major block to product development teams is senior R&D management, telling them they must deliver faster. You bet. How do I convince them to trust that the team is delivering what I want them to do? Good question, Colin. And I think this is central to product management's role as opposed to development's role. So to the extent that you are able to attach business outcomes and user outcomes to the work you're doing, suddenly you're talking about things that make much more impact on the business and the stakeholders. So for instance, if you're able to make a workflow improvement that reduces the dropout rate on your e-commerce site by 3%, right? That's a huge win, and that might represent tens or 50s of millions of euros to your company, right? And I'd be riding that horse instead of the velocity horse, which is to go back to both R&D management and the rest of the organization to say, this story or this epic is going to represent, we don't know, 20 or 40 million extra euros next year. So the fact that we're running a little late doesn't matter because we're going to deliver real money and value to the company. And if it takes a little longer, it takes a little longer. Likewise, when you're fixing a bug, when there's a ticket for something that it represents 8% of all the incoming support calls, right? We want to be trumpeting the outcome, which is when we fix this login issue, we expect to see ticket volumes to our support team drop order of 5 or 6%. And we can cost that out as to what those folks cost or what we can have them work on instead. So over and over again, I'm going to make the point that if we're not tying our epics or stories or work to business outcomes, we're always going to fall into the do it faster, because that's how folks are going to default to measure us. And we have to protect our teams by crowing, by trumpeting, by celebrating the business results of what we do, not just the velocity. And so I'm always going to intercept that and go back to my senior R&D folks and explain with them how they can be heroes with their divisional stakeholders and C-level folks by sharing the fact that we're doing business outcomes instead of just velocity. Okay, let's keep going. Daniel has a question here. How would you suggest giving the team exposure to the customer without proxies for a white label B2C product? Okay, good question. I am hoping that even if we don't, by the way, white label means that our name is not on it. B2C means it's for consumers. We should still be able to reach out and even pretend that we're third-party research organizations to the folks in our B2C community, to our consumer users. So you may not advertise yourselves as the developers of this stuff, but it's the same research we would do if we didn't have any customers yet. We would perhaps get a market research team or a recruiting team to find us 25 consumers who look like our customers, or may even in fact be our users if we have a list. We would probably offer them the $25 Amazon gift card or whatever it is to get on the horn with us, to talk us through what they're doing. And we might even pretend that it's not our product, right? But what we're trying to do is we're trying to interrogate them about what works, what doesn't work, what changes they would make, what troubles they have. We might have them show us how to use the product. If it exists on a laptop or a phone and we can do screen sharing, we might ask them for that $25 to show us how they use the product and narrate along. There's a lot of good services. There's one called usertesting.com that will recruit folks for you who are not your current users, but are like your current users. So you create some personas here, and you would pay those end users to try to successfully use your product, and you'd watch them and you'd record it and you'd try your best not to help. And we're going to learn all kinds of things watching people use our stuff. Okay, so yeah, white label's a little extra work, but we're going to go do it. Okay, Aaron says, how would you successfully work with a design council or committee? That's a hard one. I'm going to maybe split this into two pieces. So there might be a design council or committee for the company's branding as a whole. So there might be a marketing organization that hires some really expensive design firm, IDEO or somebody, spends $1 million on changing the blue on your logo to a slightly different blue and have everybody re-implement it because they think it's better. For those folks, I think you just have to say yes. But if the design council or committee is trying to get into workflows and the details of your product, I'd be looking to be the defender and promoter of my designer. And we would go in those meetings together and we would present real facts back to our usertesting.com or whatever our videos of real users trying to do our stuff. We're going to bring evidence that shows that my designer, my developer, and I really understand our end users better than that committee, if we can. And we're going to show them that we'll stay within their guidelines as best we can, but we're going to solve the problems at hand the way we're going to solve them. And if they don't like it, they can go to me or my boss. When I'm parachuting in as the head of product, again, that's something I do fairly often. I think it's the head of product or the chief product officer's job or the VP of product to deal with these political issues where folks want to help and they're not much help. So if you're the product manager or the designer, figure out who the most senior person is in your company who can defend the right approach, right? And go ask for help. Okay. Okay, Mahesh, no, Catherine's next, sorry. All right, we're gonna just take these in order. I lost my place here, sorry. Okay, how do you manage the team talking to end users when the team is dedicated to implementing the back end of an interface for other teams. I'm going to interpret this to mean that you might have an infrastructure team, for instance, that's building APIs or underlying storage or security things for other organizations, other teams, right? Where the real end user may not be the key person. Here I'm going to substitute, in some sense, I'm going to want us to interview the consuming teams. So if we have a front end team that's doing commerce and we are the team that delivers up user profiles, I did this at Yahoo years ago, we want to be really clear both on their goals, and we want to ask them a lot of questions about why the improvement is going to trickle through to their and our end users. So I think we have a sort of two-step process here. We got to make sure there's technical fit, because generally the internal teams asking for stuff are asking in technical terms for features. But we really want to also follow that through in case that team is doing something that might have a bad impact on end users. So likewise, if you're building APIs for external third-party developers, you really want to interrogate those developers about how to make your APIs or product better. Okay, Mahesh wants to know, as a XXX, these are usually personas. Do we need personas? Some people love personas, some people hate personas. I think if personas are useful for what you are doing, then you should use them. I do try to wave folks away from fake personas, where we invent a person in our own head, we give them a name and a picture, we write down all about them without having talked to people like that fake persona. So I would wait on building personas until we've done enough interviews, real live interviews with real live users, that we're starting to see the personas clump together, that we're seeing the patterns. And then we might choose one or two of the folks that we really did interview and turn them into personas, delete their last name, right? Maybe or maybe not use their picture. But I see much more value in personas that are anchored in actual live humans than creating them on the fly when they're wrong and useless. Okay, Lisa. Hey, Lisa, welcome from the Bay Area. The value is in the smartness of the thinking, she says, team collaboration toward the goal. So I think, Lisa, you're just suggesting that you like that phrase, which is good. Maybe I'll use it again. And just to reiterate her point and my point, nobody cares what format you do this stuff in unless they're focused on the wrong end of the process telescope, right? If the stories tell us and our team what we need to do, they're working. If they don't tell us and our team what we need to do, they're not working. You should change them as often as you like in any format that you think is going to be useful, right? Because, and many of you may know this, but every member of your development team believes they're smarter than you are if you're a product manager, and many of them are right. So telling them what to do isn't the goal. Collaborating on understanding is the goal. Okay, let's keep going. Bobek says, twice a year we run user groups to better understand our customers and end users. I think that's okay, but I would worry about a lot of bias issues in running twice a year user groups. First of all, the people who come to your user groups are already customers. They probably like you. The folks who hate your product don't come to user groups. They're enthusiastic and they're really willing to work around problems. Also, they tend to be people who are much, much more familiar with or long-term users of your stuff. So I think it's fine to do user testing at user groups, but you've left out most of the world. If you're not paying people who are not your customers to try to log in or install or do a basic transaction with your product, then you're missing the fact that you may be losing hundreds of thousands of folks who are unable to get your stuff working but never report it, right? Likewise, you want to be careful to separate expert users from novice users. Often at the user group, you've got the best and brightest and longest standing, and they know all this stuff and they've figured out all your workarounds, where your naive new users are stumbling everywhere. So be very, very conscious of the selection bias you're putting in place. One last group that you're missing here is really important. User groups never include anybody who's churned off your product out of frustration, right? If people quit your service or stop using your stuff, they'll never show up at user groups. You should have some regular cadence where you're interviewing people who walked away and have legitimate complaints, because that's the best way we're going to identify things we can do to keep the next cohort of folks from walking away and having complaints. Okay, Babak has another one here. What are the benefits of talking to end users a few times a month compared with other? Okay, I think I answered that one, right? So the world changes, and so frequently, frequent conversations are important, and volume is important here. It's easy to have sort of selection bias or recency bias. You hear something once and you universalize it. If you're talking to 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 users a month, you're getting a good distribution of opinions, and you're less likely to get stuck on some corner issue. Okay, great. All right, John's reposting a couple of questions. How do you deal with a development team only speaking English, but your customers can't? In their case, they speak German. How do you bring context to the team? Really good question. And John, this is one that as an American, I can say I ignore, because Americans have the bad habit of believing that everyone in the world deals in English, in American English, in dollars, and in US time zones and US currencies, everything. So we're rather small-minded and biased here. But this is a challenge. I might, if your user's in German, you may not even be able to run this interview. You may have to get someone else. I'd be looking for translation tools, some kind of transcription. Maybe there's somebody in your extended team who does speak some German and wants to sit in. That would be a great benefit. We do the best we can, right? So recordings are good, snippets are good, quotes are good. Do what you can do. Okay, and the other question that John's reposted, what process is there in place to look back at a feature post-release to judge whether it was successful? Okay, this is something that every single one of us should be doing. Certainly if we have a SaaS product, if it lives in the cloud, we should all be instrumenting our products, every feature we add. So I highlighted John Cutler there from Amplitude. There's a whole bunch of great products in the space. Pendo, and there's like 25 other products that all let you instrument your software, and you should be able to see every mouse click, every call for help, every back button, every failed transaction. And so we should set ourselves 2 goals when we ship a new feature. The first one is we should have an intention for how many folks are going to use it, and the supporting goal is we better instrument it so we can measure that. And if we roll out a new feature and nobody's using it, well, there's 2 ways to go. One is to maybe hope we did something wrong and interview a bunch of the people who aren't using it, but who should have been. And maybe they didn't notice. We need a campaign. We need a bigger button. We need to train. Or maybe the feature's just no good and we're going to find out it's no good. We're going to take it out, right? But shipping features and not having a plan to measure them, I would tell you that's product management malpractice, right? Don't do it. Okay, let's keep going. We got 5 more minutes. Ron wants to know, how do you balance not having to worry about when to ship the product with regulatory dates? Well, if it's a regulatory date, if there's a law that says you must get something done on time, then you better get it done on time. I do observe, though, that often stakeholder groups within your company will tell you there's a fixed regulatory date, and it's often not so, right? So dig in. Now, if it's a regulatory date and we must meet that, often we're going to trim features or content, right? We all know that we can't have perfect software on time with quality on a particular date and infinite scope. So we might decide that in order to protect that fixed regulatory date, we're only going to do the 2 or 3 most important things for that feature, and 5 more are going to follow later, right? Just because some government body passes a regulation, it doesn't deny the law of gravity. So your team can't do anything any faster than it can. If you've got to get this done, you're going to have to shift some other work around and put some slack in. Every developer I know is an optimist. Every software schedule runs late. If you're up against it here, figure out what you're going to sacrifice early on to make those dates. Okay, we're going to keep going. We've got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to stay on longer for anybody who wants, but everybody else can duck out. Okay, sorry. A little fast scrolling here. Brandon wants to know, working with an early stage lean startup team as a product manager, my exposure to end users is by joining sales meetings or fulfillment meetings with existing customers. Wrong approach. Yes, 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 wrong approach. As a product manager, you have two distinct kinds of jobs. One is to help sales close deals. The other is to figure out what's going on. When you're in a sales meeting, your job is not to learn. Your job is not to ask open-ended questions. Your job is not to interrogate prospects about what else they're looking at and what they paid for it. Your job is to help close the two questions that the sales team highlighted for you and why they brought you in. Sales meetings are absolutely the worst place to do interesting, open-ended, wandering, exploratory discussions. So yes, you must be in sales meetings. And no, they're absolutely the wrong place to do the good validation and exploring and discovery we have to do. So you're going to have to set up both kinds of meetings. Sorry, it's a tough job. Okay, Johnny wants to know, how do successful managers you work with split their time between working with R&D teams, customers, executives? Why? I generally start my teams, particularly if they haven't had good discipline. I say, you're going to spend half of your time, every single person on my team, going to spend half of their time with their development team, and they're going to spend half their time outward facing. And coming back to Brendan's question, some of that's going to be sales calls, some of that's going to be competitive analysis, much of that's going to be interviews or discovery work. Other things you're going to do, you may be helping recruit partners. You're probably working on pricing and packaging and economics, right? So I think every single person on my team needs to do both. I don't really believe in the technical product manager facing inward or the product owner facing inward and the market facing product manager facing outward and two in a box. It's inefficient. It doesn't use people's talents. So I will tell everyone on my team they're going to split half and half. Anybody who doesn't like that is going to get a promotion pretty quickly to some other department in the company. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Let's see, here's one from Dorina. What techniques have you used to successfully, as a product manager, try to shift the mindset of a diverse team, UX, speech scientists, from output to outcome? I don't really find it that hard, but I think I have to lead with a strong story. I have to convince them that the reason we're doing something, a particular feature or capability, is because real users are going to use it. That enthuses them, that gets them excited, right? And it gives purpose, right? So what we're doing here is we're moving from outcome, output as date to outcome as purpose, right? If you were working on some piece of software for pharmaceutical companies to try to find a cure or a vaccine for COVID-19, that would be really motivating to your team. And the sooner we can get it done, the better, rather than we have a date to ship. Okay, so we're at the top of the hour. So let me ask our hosts if we want to cut or we want to keep going. So please mic in. All right, I think, go ahead, Ben.
Hey, Rich, how's it going? Yeah, I think we're good to go for another 5 or 10 minutes if that suits yourself. There seems to be a few other questions there, so
good, perfect.
By all means, power through.
Yeah, so folks should drop off as they need to, but let me find my place back in the questions, and we'll do as many as we have. And if I didn't answer your question, do drop me an email because I'm easy to find. Okay, so how does one convince the senior management team to move away from obsessing with velocity? We may have answered that. This is really hard. This is a selling problem, and it's a behavior modification problem. So I'd look to the senior most folks on your team to have this conversation with your managers, with your execs 20 times, 50 times until they finally get it, because it's not the natural thing. Again, I'd be highlighting business outcomes because that's what they really care about. Mostly non-tech executives talk about velocity because they don't know what else to ask about. Okay. Currently working as a PM on an XP team, do you have suggestions for minimizing work in process through pair rotation? We rotate pairs every day. You know, Mark, I am not an XP ace. Worked with a couple of XP teams over the years. I hear from folks that XP is tremendously productive and makes your folks happy, so I'm glad you're doing it. I don't know. So I would turn this back around and ask the question we asked before, which is, can you and your team sit down for 30 minutes or 25 minutes and brainstorm a couple or three different suggestions for how you might minimize work in process as you rotate, and try one. At the end of the week, thumbs up, thumbs down, you didn't like it, try the next, right? So there's no particular reason why the basic small a agile theory here won't apply, but I've got no good answers for you. Okay, let's see what else we have. Karen wants to know, what do you think about moving away from user stories to a full detailed spec? Good question, Karen. So here's my concern. My concern is who's going to write the spec, okay? Let me give you some horrible examples and then some good examples. If your internal non-technical stakeholders are writing specs or your customers are writing specs, then my expectation is most of the specs are wrong or bad or missing or incomplete or fanciful and impossible, right? So if the folks writing specs are far from your team, then I'm really, really, really unhappy about having somebody who's not a member of your team decide what your team's going to do and how they're going to do it. Because full detailed specs are an entire how. Occasionally, again, if there's legislation or it's a third-party API that you must support, then the spec comes along with it. But for me, it's almost always the wrong answer. Now let's pull that in and say, you as the product manager might write the fully detailed spec. I think, again, it's less bad, but you're wasting the chance to have your team save you work and have this be a better spec. So if it's completely obvious, sure, go ahead, I guess. But as soon as you're writing specs, I think you want to look around your team and figure out who the 2 or 3 folks are who are going to implement it or who care or who are smarter. And I would start with the user story or whatever your equivalent is. And I'd probably, for the more interesting, meaty stuff, probably have several people take the 20 minutes out or the hour out and collectively write the spec. And then ship it around to the team to mark up, because implementing a spec that's wrong is 100% waste, no matter how well you wrote it. Okay, let's see what else we got. And my Irish is bad, so I'll say Trianco, but that's wrong. Specs are important. We convert our user stories and specs after the fact, and some stuff starts as specs. Yeah, that's fine. Works for me. Okay, John's saying he had some bad memories of waterfall projects. Colin, for enterprise products with a small user base of large companies, what alternatives are there for the type of quantitative data often cited? I mostly do enterprise, and I observe there's actually 2 completely different communities at your enterprises. There's the senior execs who sign off on purchase orders and don't actually care what your product does, don't know what its name is, have never logged in, and have lots of suggestions for how to fix it. You want to ignore them as best you can. And then if it's a product that's getting any traction in the enterprise, it may be a small number of companies, but it's often not a small number of end users, right? So if you're doing some accounts payable system for some big bank, it's one logo, it's one customer, it's one corporation, but there might be 150 people using it. So if you're in one of those large fan outs, I think you want to find a few people at each of your major customers, and you want to delve in and find out what they're doing. If it's really only one person who's using it at each of those customers, do the best you can, make friends with them, buy them lunch, be on their calendar all the time, because there won't be enough spread, there won't be enough data, there won't be enough points to really get some, some good analytics here. Okay, Karen says, we used to do an initial spec and then do user stories. Whoops, I lost her there. Now full detailed spec on slides and link it to the user story. Well, okay, same concern. I don't care where it lives. I don't care if it's in Jira or it's on a slide or it's on a post-it note or it's written on a whiteboard. I want to make sure that the full detailed specs have been built with the participation of the development team, not simply given to the development team, because otherwise we're mostly building the wrong stuff. Okay. Jenny wants to know, how do you determine what's the right criteria for measuring success and adoption? This is very, very dependent on your business and your audience. In some consumer spaces, if less than a couple or 4% of your customers, your users, are doing something, maybe it doesn't matter. In some of the enterprise spaces, it might be a feature that's only used once a year. If anybody's used Xero, which starts with an X, or any of the other online accounting packages in the US, you would know that we have a once a year report out of that that generates a particular kind of tax reporting that's needed. And for the rest of the year, nobody ever pushes that button. So it's really handy to know the context of your feature, because if you took that button out in January because nobody used it in the previous 6 months, and then everybody needs it on April 14th here in the US, it's a catastrophe. So be really thoughtful about why users need the features. And then you want to tie your metric to some success of using that feature in the way that we intended it to be of value. Okay, so we're going to keep going. We'll see if there's anything more here. Gaurav has one. How can you forecast the cost of capabilities for a few quarters if the capabilities are not well defined? This usually comes from finance. My answer, no, you can't forecast the cost of capabilities, right? Software development's not a science. We really don't know what it's going to cost to build. And in general, we're less concerned with the cost than with the upside. So I would be much more concerned with showing the finance folks why the feature adds value, how it's going to lead to more money or fewer tech support cases or lower AWS costs or something else than development costs, because they're always wrong. So finance folks have this weird belief that we can exactly forecast development costs. They're entirely wrong. Buy them a drink instead. Okay, we're getting near the end here. Let's see. Bring your whole, Mark says, bring your whole development team into consumer problem and solution along with retros takes away from development time. Yes, it does. Does this sound like velocity is too much the focus? Yes, it sounds that way. I actually don't see these things reducing velocity. Shockingly enough, what I see is that motivated teams that understand the problems they're solving actually get more work done faster and better. I would turn this around and say, if you're not letting your development team understand the problems and the solutions, then you have more nominal velocity because you're shipping things faster, but you're throwing them away at 5 times the rate that you would otherwise. If you look at a month or a quarter instead of a week, you'll find that the velocity associated with real value, with solving problems, with getting good work done is probably much higher when you've engaged your team's emotion and understanding and love for their users. Endlessly, I see developers working nights and weekends to solve a problem that they heard some user complain about directly instead of the product manager complaining. They want to make these folks happy. And the better we can channel real users and real needs, the harder our team works, the smarter our team works, the better they solve these problems. I turn it around the other way and say, more velocity comes from more discussion and more problem solution and more retros, not the other way around. Okay, I think we're at the end of our hour and 10 minutes here. So I'm going to stop. Ben, do you have any last words before we sign off? And I'm going to just quick forward us on to my contact information in case anybody doesn't know where to find me.
No, I think we're good, Rich. Thanks so much. That was awesome. That was our first virtual meetup for ProductTank Dublin, and seemed to go smooth enough, I hope. So, yeah, thanks a million, Rich. Really, really appreciate your time. And
terrific. And I hope next year to be able to do this again live in person in Dublin.
Yes, yes, hopefully so. But yeah, thanks a million, Rich. Really, really appreciate it. And we'll leave it there.
Okay, everybody stay well and safe.
Thanks. See ya.